The sun was setting over the Virginia suburbs, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Agent Johnson drummed her fingers lightly on the steering wheel of her charcoal gray sedan, her mind still processing the classified briefing she'd just left. 12 years in the CIA had taught her to always stay alert, but tonight she felt especially drained after reviewing intelligence reports for hours. The peaceful drive home was interrupted by flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. She checked her speedometer, 32 in a 35 zone. With the practiced calm of a seasoned intelligence officer, she pulled over, positioning her car perfectly on the shoulder of the quiet suburban street. Following the protocol ingrained in her through both professional and personal experience, she kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. The dome light was already on, and her credentials were waiting in the center console, both her driver's license and her federal identification. She could hear the crunch of gravel under boots as the officer approached. License and registration, came the clipped command through the window. Agent Johnson noticed the officer's hand resting on his holster, a detail her training wouldn't let her miss. She spoke in a clear, measured tone. "Officer, my federal credentials are in the center console. I'm going to reach for them slowly." The officer's flashlight beam cut through her car's interior. "Just the license and registration," he repeated, more firmly this time. Something in his tone made her pause. This wasn't the usual respectful acknowledgement she typically received when identifying herself as a federal agent. "Sir, I'm a federal agent," she tried again, maintaining her professional composure. "I'm reaching for my credentials now." She moved with deliberate slowness, but the officer's reaction was immediate and concerning. "Step out of the vehicle." The command was sharp, and suddenly there were 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind her. Their lights transformed the quiet street into a disco of red and blue, drawing curious faces to nearby windows. Agent Johnson's mind raced through her options. Her training had prepared her for high-stakes situations in foreign countries, yet here she was, less than 10 miles from CIA headquarters, facing a situation that made her pulse quicken. She knew every move she made next would matter. As she carefully exited the vehicle, she noticed a young teenager recording with their phone from a nearby porch. Her dashcam was running too, standard procedure she'd learned to follow years ago. The whole scene was being documented from multiple angles, though that fact didn't seem to deter the officer's aggressive stance. "Face the vehicle, hands on the hood." The officer's voice carried down the street. Agent Johnson complied, even as she felt the familiar weight of her CIA credentials in her blazer pocket. Years of undercover work had taught her to read situations quickly, and everything about this one felt wrong. More officers arrived, and she could hear their radios crackling with static and coded communications. The original officer was now joined by 3 others, their attitudes ranging from aggressive to uncertain as they realized this might not be a routine traffic stop. "I'm reaching for my federal credentials," she announced again, her voice steady despite the tension, inside left blazer pocket. But before she could move, she felt her arms being pulled behind her back. The cold kiss of handcuffs against her wrists sent a shock through her system, not of fear, but of absolute clarity. This moment, she realized, would have consequences far beyond this suburban street. Through it all, Agent Johnson maintained her composure, her mind already cataloging every detail, every face, every word spoken. Her CIA training had taught her to turn challenging situations into opportunities for intelligence gathering. As she was led to the patrol car, she noticed the officer's nameplate, his badge number, the make and model of each police vehicle, and the growing number of witnesses with their phones raised. What these officers didn't realize was that they hadn't just detained any federal agent. They detained one of the CIA's top intelligence analysts, someone who'd spent her career understanding patterns, connecting dots, and uncovering hidden truths. As she sat in the back of the patrol car, watching the officers argue among themselves as they finally discovered her legitimate credentials, she knew this incident would be more than just another story of law enforcement overreach. This was going to be the beginning of something much bigger, something that would challenge both her professional skills and her personal convictions. As the officers huddled around her credentials, making frantic phone calls to their superiors, Agent Johnson began mentally preparing for what she knew would be a long and complicated journey toward justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever found themselves in a similar situation with far fewer resources to fight back. The morning after the incident, Agent Johnson sat in her kitchen, staring at her untouched coffee. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. The video of her detention had spread faster than a wildfire in August, and now everyone wanted a piece of her story. "This isn't just about you anymore," a CIA supervisor had said during their early morning call. She could hear the concern in his voice, mixed with something else, frustration, maybe, or fear. "We need to contain this. There are operations that could be compromised." She picked up her phone again, scrolling through the messages. Civil rights organizations had somehow found her number. A prominent black women's advocacy group wanted her to speak at their next rally. Local news stations were camping outside her house, their vans lined up like hungry birds waiting for crumbs. Running her fingers across her credentials, she thought about the weight they carried, or should have carried, last night. 12 years of serving her country, of putting national security above personal comfort, of making sacrifices most people would never know about. And in one moment, none of that had mattered because of what the officer saw first: the color of her skin. Her doorbell rang for the third time that morning. Through the security camera, she could see another reporter, microphone in hand, ready to turn her experience into the next viral story. She ignored it, just like she'd ignored the others. Instead, she opened her laptop and pulled up the police report from last night. Her intelligence training kicked in automatically as she read between the lines of the sanitized official account. Something wasn't adding up. The officer's stated reason for the stop, a burnt-out taillight, didn't match the dashcam footage showing her perfectly maintained vehicle. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. "Baby, I saw the video." Her mom's voice was thick with emotion. "Are you okay? Do you need me to come over?" "I'm fine, Mom," she replied, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "Just another day being black in America, right?" "Don't you dare brush this off." Her mother's tone sharpened. "You've worked too hard to let this slide. Use your position. Make them listen." The words hit home. She thought about all the similar incidents that never made headlines because the victims didn't have her resources, her training, her platform. But using that platform came with risks, to her career, to ongoing operations, to the very work she dedicated her life to. Her CIA team was working on critical domestic security threats. Drawing attention to herself could compromise years of careful intelligence gathering. Yet staying silent felt like betraying every person who'd ever faced similar discrimination without the power to fight back. Her phone buzzed again. Another civil rights attorney offering to take her case pro bono. She added the message to her growing folder of evidence, her analytical mind already mapping connections and patterns. Walking to her home office, she pulled out a fresh notebook, old school, no digital trail. At the top of the page, she wrote "Incident Analysis." Below it, she began listing questions. Why this street? Why that officer? Why had backup arrived so quickly for a routine traffic stop? Her CIA training had taught her that coincidences were rarely coincidental. As she worked, a plan began to form. She couldn't be the loud voice the activists wanted, but she could be something potentially more powerful, a quiet catalyst for change working through the system she knew best. Her laptop pinged with a new email from her supervisor. "Meeting tomorrow, 800. Director wants to discuss options." She knew what that meant. They'd try to bury this, to protect the agency's operations and image. It was the logical move from an intelligence perspective. But as she stood by her window, watching another news van pull up outside, she made her decision. She wouldn't let them bury this. Instead, she'd do what she did best: gather intelligence, analyze patterns, and build a case that no one could ignore. Her phone buzzed one more time. A message from a fellow agent, another woman of color. "We're behind you, whatever you decide." That's when it hit her. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one federal agent. This was about using her unique position at the intersection of law enforcement, intelligence, and minority communities to create real change. She picked up her phone and began typing a response to her supervisor, looking forward to the meeting. "I have some suggestions about how we can handle this for everyone's benefit." As she hit send, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. the same calm that helped her handle high-pressure situations in the field. She had a mission now, one that would require all her skills as an intelligence officer. But this time, the mission wasn't just about national security. It was about something equally important: justice. Opening her notebook again, she began mapping out her strategy. She'd need allies, evidence, and most importantly, patience. Change wouldn't come overnight, but she was trained for long-term operations. This would be her most important mission yet, not despite her position in the CIA, but because of it. The sun was setting outside her window, marking 24 hours since the traffic stop that started it all. She looked at her reflection in the darkening glass, seeing not a victim, but a highly trained federal agent with the skills and position to make a real difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she had work to do. The basement office hummed with the sound of old fluorescent lights and even older computer fans. Agent Johnson had chosen this space carefully, a forgotten corner of the CIA building where few people ventured. Perfect for what she needed to do. 3 monitors glowed in front of her, each displaying different pieces of the puzzle she was slowly piecing together. The first showed traffic stop data from the past 5 years in the county where she was detained. The second displayed personnel records she'd managed to obtain through official channels. The third ran facial recognition on protest footage from the past year. She took a sip of her now cold coffee and leaned back in her chair. 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and she'd spent every free moment digging deeper into what happened that night. Her training told her that nothing was random. There were always patterns if you knew where to look. "You're still here." A voice from the doorway made her quickly minimize several windows. It was her colleague from the aged desk, looking concerned. "It's almost midnight." "Just finishing up some analysis," she replied, careful to keep her tone casual. Few people knew what she was really working on, and she wanted to keep it that way. After her colleague left, she pulled the files back up. The traffic stop data was telling an interesting story. Over the past 3 years, there had been a significant spike in stops involving federal employees, particularly those from minority backgrounds. Most were brief encounters, nothing as dramatic as her experience, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her phone buzzed, a message from one of her new contacts in local law enforcement. "Check your email. You'll want to see this." The email contained an internal memo about a new police training program implemented 18 months ago. As she read through it, her pulse quickened. The program had been run by a private security firm with some questionable connections. She added it to her growing wall of evidence, connecting it with red yarn to other key pieces of information. A knock on her office door made her jump. It was the night janitor, an older man who'd been working in the building longer than she'd been alive. "Working late again?" he asked, emptying her trash can. "You know, my daughter had something similar happen to her last month. She works for the FBI." Agent Johnson's attention snapped fully to the janitor. "Your daughter, would she be willing to talk to me?" An hour later, she had another piece of the puzzle. The janitor's daughter's experience matched several others she'd documented. Same area, similar aggressive response, same dismissal of federal credentials. But something else caught her attention. The private security firm that ran the police training program had also provided consulting services to several federal agencies. She pulled up another database, this one containing information about ongoing CIA operations in the region. As she cross-referenced dates and locations, her blood ran cold. The areas with the highest concentration of these suspicious traffic stops overlapped perfectly with locations where the CIA was conducting domestic counterintelligence operations. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug deeper. The private security firm had connections to a larger organization that had been on the CIA's radar for months, a group suspected of attempting to identify and track federal agents. The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a disturbing picture. This wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. Someone was using local law enforcement to gather intelligence on federal agents, particularly those from minority backgrounds who might be more vulnerable to harassment. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost missed the notification on her phone. A text from her mother. "Baby, you missed Sunday dinner again. Whatever you're working on, don't forget to take care of yourself." Looking at the time, she realized she'd been in the office for 15 hours straight. Her mother was right, she needed to pace herself. This investigation was becoming more complex than she'd imagined, and she needed to stay sharp. As she packed up her things, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a secure message from one of her CIA teammates. Strange activity detected at location Delta. Might be related to your project. Watch your back. Location Delta was less than a mile from where she'd been pulled over. Coincidence? She didn't think so. Driving home, she took a different route than usual, watching for any signs of surveillance. Her training kicked in automatically, varying her speed, taking random turns, watching for cars that stayed with her too long. Back in her apartment, she added the new information to her secure files. The wall of evidence was growing, but so were the risks. She was no longer just investigating a case of racial profiling, she'd stumbled onto something much bigger. Before going to bed, she made 3 encrypted copies of everything she'd discovered so far. One went into her safe, one to a secure server, and one to a trusted colleague with instructions to release it if anything happened to her. Looking out her window at the quiet street below, she thought about how a simple traffic stop had led her down this rabbit hole. But that's how intelligence work often went. Pull on one thread, and you never knew what might unravel. Tomorrow, she would brief her supervisor on some of what she'd found. Not everything. She needed to be strategic about what she revealed and when, but enough to ensure that the agency couldn't ignore the implications. As she finally lay down to sleep, her mother's words echoed in her head. Use your position. Make them listen. She was doing exactly that, but in a way nobody expected. Sometimes the quietest investigations had the loudest impact. Her last thought before drifting off was of all the other federal agents who'd been targeted. They might not know it yet, but she was fighting for them too. And she was just getting started. Rain drummed against the windows of the small coffee shop as Agent Johnson sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall. Old habits die hard. She checked her watch again. The police sergeant was 10 minutes late. She'd received his message through secure channels 3 days ago. Need to talk. What you're investigating goes deeper than you know. After thoroughly vetting him, she'd agreed to this meeting. The bell above the door chimed, and a tall man in civilian clothes walked in, shaking rain from his jacket. Sergeant Reynolds had 25 years on the force and a reputation for being old-school straight arrow. His face carried the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't lost their moral compass. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the booth. "Had to make sure I wasn't followed." He ordered coffee when the waitress came by, then waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. "What you found about that security firm? It's just the tip of the iceberg." Over the next hour, Reynolds shared his own observations, things that hadn't felt right in his department over the past year. New training protocols that seemed designed to create confrontations rather than prevent them. Officers with clean records suddenly becoming aggressive during routine stops, especially with minority federal agents. "I've been collecting evidence," he said, sliding a thumb drive across the table. "But I'm just a sergeant. Nobody wants to hear it from me." As she pocketed the drive, her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "The congressman's office called again. Says it's important." The congressman in question was a first-time representative who'd been making waves pushing for police reform. His office had been trying to reach her for days. She'd been hesitant to involve politicians, but now... "I need to go," she told Reynolds. "But we'll talk again." She passed him a burner phone. "Use this. Only this." An hour later, she sat in Congressman Chen's office, watching him review some of the evidence she'd gathered. His reaction wasn't what she expected. "This goes beyond police reform," he said, taking off his glasses to rub his eyes. "This is systematic targeting of federal agents. But why?" "I have a theory," she replied, pulling out her laptop. She showed him the pattern she'd discovered, how the traffic stops correlated with CIA operations, how the private security firm connected to known anti-government groups. "Someone's using routine traffic stops to map federal agent movements," the congressman said slowly. "And they're exploiting racial bias to do it." "Exactly. Officers with implicit biases are more likely to stop and harass minority federal agents, creating more data points for whoever's behind this." The congressman leaned back in his chair. "This is bigger than my police reform bill. We need to move carefully." Her phone buzzed again. A message from Reynolds. "Found something. Need to meet tonight." As she left the congressman's office, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Through the Rain Street windows, she could see someone taking photos. Instead of heading to her car, she walked to the nearby metro station, using the techniques she'd learned at the CIA to spot and elude surveillance. That evening, in another quiet cafe, Reynolds shared his discovery. Remember that security firm? They're conducting specialized training sessions. Invitation only, night training. He pushed a document across the table. These are the names of officers who've gone through it, including the one who stopped you. She scanned the list, her trained eye catching patterns. Many of the officers had similar backgrounds, similar psychological profiles. They were being selected, but for what? Her phone lit up with a text from her CIA supervisor. "We need to talk. Tomorrow morning. Early." She looked at Reynolds, this veteran cop who'd risked his career to help expose the truth. "Things are going to move quickly now," she said. "Are you ready for what comes next?" He gave her a grim smile. "Been ready. Just needed the right partner in this fight." Back home, she added Reynolds' information to her growing case file. The wall of evidence now covered an entire room, red strings connecting photos, documents, and timelines. But it wasn't just paper and string, it was people. Reynolds with his old-school integrity, Congressman Chen with his reform agenda, her CIA colleagues who'd been quietly supporting her investigation. Her mother called as she was reviewing the new documents. "You missed dinner again." "I know, Mom, but I'm making progress, real progress. Just be careful, baby. I know that look you get when you're onto something big." After hanging up, she stood at her window, watching the rain. The black SUV was back, parked 2 blocks down. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. Her burner phone buzzed. "Reynolds again. More officers want to come forward. They're tired of being used." She smiled. The web of allies was growing. Each person brought their own piece of the puzzle, their own skills and resources. Together, they were building something powerful, a coalition that crossed the usual lines between law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and civilian oversight. Tomorrow's meeting with her supervisor would be crucial. She'd have to play it carefully, reveal enough to get the agency's support without showing all her cards. The stakes were getting higher, but so was her confidence. Before bed, she sent one last message to Reynolds. "Tell those officers to document everything. Every detail matters." As she finally lay down to sleep, she thought about how this had all started with one traffic stop. Now it had grown into something that could reshape the relationship between law enforcement and federal agencies, while addressing deep-rooted biases in the system. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Be careful. She would be. But she wouldn't stop. Not when she had allies like Reynolds and Chen, not when she was finally unraveling the truth behind what happened that night. The rain continued outside, washing the city clean. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new allies, new discoveries. But for the first time since this all began, she felt like they had a real chance at exposing the truth and creating lasting change. The early morning CIA briefing room felt colder than usual. Agent Johnson stood before a group of senior officials, her presentation materials ready. This was the moment when everything would change. "What I'm about to show you isn't just about one traffic stop," she began, clicking through to her first slide. "It's about a coordinated effort to compromise our operations." The room stayed silent as she laid out her evidence. Traffic stop data, training records, financial transactions, surveillance photos. Each piece alone meant little, but together they told a disturbing story. The security firm running these police training programs. She pulled up a complex network diagram. "It's a front. We've been tracking their parent company for months in connection with domestic intelligence gathering operations." Her supervisor leaned forward, his face tightening. "You're saying they're using routine traffic stops to track our agents?" "Not just track them," she replied, clicking to the next slide. "They're building a database. Every confrontation creates a data point. Where our agents live, their routes, their patterns. And they're specifically targeting minority agents, using existing biases in law enforcement to create more opportunities for these interactions." The room erupted in low murmurs. She could see the implications hitting home. This wasn't just a civil rights issue anymore, it was a national security threat. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Reynolds. "Emergency. Need to meet now." There's more, she continued, keeping her voice steady despite the urgent message burning in her pocket. The training programs aren't just collecting data. They're conditioning officers to react aggressively to federal credentials, creating confrontations that wouldn't normally happen. She showed them video clips from recent incidents, other federal agents, similar experiences to her own. The pattern was undeniable. After the briefing, she rushed to meet Reynolds at their usual coffee shop. His face told her something was wrong before he even spoke. "They're cleaning house," he said, voice low. "3 officers who went through that special training program disappeared last night. Just vanished. No paperwork, no traces." She felt her pulse quicken. They're trying to cover their tracks. That's not all. He slid a file across the table. Found this in the training program files. They've been profiling potential recruits, looking for officers with specific psychological traits, ones who could be influenced. Opening the file, she saw psychological evaluations, personality assessments. They weren't just exploiting existing biases, they were actively seeking officers who could be manipulated into becoming their unwitting agents. Her secure phone buzzed. "Congressman Chen, just got word. The security firm is shutting down operations, moving everything offshore." She looked at Reynolds. "They know we're onto them." Back at her apartment, she reviewed everything they'd uncovered. The wall of evidence now told a clear story. A sophisticated operation using racial profiling as cover for intelligence gathering. That exploited existing tensions between law enforcement and minority communities, turning routine traffic stops into data collection opportunities. Her mother called, sensing something was wrong. "You sound tired, baby." "I'm close, Mom. So close to exposing everything, but it's bigger than we thought. Just remember what I taught you. Sometimes the biggest battles are won by being smarter, not louder." Those words stuck with her as she prepared for the next day's FBI briefing. She'd worked with Reynolds to get federal protection for the officers willing to testify. Congressman Chen was quietly building support for a broader investigation. The pieces were in place, but timing would be crucial. If they moved too soon, evidence would disappear. Too late, and more agents could be compromised. Her secure laptop pinged with an encrypted message from one of her CIA contacts. Facial recognition hit. "Your officer from the traffic stop. Just boarded a plane to Belgrade." They were running, but they'd left too many traces, too many breadcrumbs. The network of allies she built, from street-level cops to congressional staff, had created a web of surveillance watching the watchers. That night, as she updated her evidence wall one last time, she thought about how it all connected. The traffic stop that started it all wasn't random. They targeted her because she was exactly what they feared. A highly trained federal agent who could see through their operation, who had the skills and determination to expose their network. Her phone lit up with messages from her growing coalition of allies. Reynolds had more officers ready to come forward. Chen's office had secured support for hearings. Her CIA team had traced the financial networks backing the operation. Standing back, looking at the full scope of what they'd uncovered, she felt a mix of pride and determination. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about protecting every federal agent who'd been targeted, every officer who'd been manipulated, every citizen whose rights had been violated in service of this shadowy operation. Tomorrow, everything would change. The evidence would go public, the investigations would become official, and the true scope of the operation would be exposed. But tonight, she allowed herself a small smile, remembering her mother's words about fighting smarter, not louder. They tried to use her identity against her, never realizing it was precisely that identity, as a black woman, as a federal agent, as someone who'd faced discrimination and overcome it, that gave her the perspective to see through their scheme and the determination to expose it. The FBI command center hummed with activity as Agent Johnson reviewed the final operation plans. Screens around the room showed surveillance feeds from multiple locations. 3 months of careful investigation had led to this moment. "Teams are in position," the FBI tactical leader reported. "We're ready when you give the word." She nodded, checking her watch. In just a few hours, they would move simultaneously on multiple targets, the security firm's remaining offices, training facilities, and key personnel. But first, she had one more meeting to handle. The small diner was nearly empty when she walked in. She'd chosen it carefully, public enough to be safe, quiet enough for conversation. The man sitting in the corner booth was the same officer who'd pulled her over that night, now back from his brief escape to Belgrade. "Thank you for coming in," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. His face showed the strain of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. "You made the right choice." "They said they'd protect me if I talked," he replied, voice barely above a whisper. "That's why I came back." Over the next hour, he filled in the final pieces of the puzzle: how he'd been recruited into the special training program, how they'd use psychological manipulation to shape officers' behavior, how they'd specifically targeted minority federal agents to gather intelligence. "I didn't understand at first," he admitted, staring into his untouched coffee. "They made it sound like we were protecting the community, identifying potential threats, but really, we were the ones being used." Her phone buzzed. A message from Reynolds. Second group of officers just came forward. They're ready to testify. Everything was falling into place. The officer's testimony would be crucial, but he wasn't alone. Across the city, other officers were coming forward, sharing similar stories of manipulation and regret. Back at the command center, she reviewed the latest intelligence. The security firm's leadership had gone to ground, but their financial trails were visible now. Congressman Chen's office had traced connections to several anti-government groups, all funded through the same offshore accounts. "Ma'am," a young analyst called her over. "You need to see this." The screen showed new data they'd uncovered. The operation went beyond just tracking federal agents. They'd been building detailed profiles, looking for vulnerabilities, planning to use the information for future operations. Her secure phone lit up with a message from her CIA supervisor. "White House has been briefed. You have full authorization." She gathered the joint FBI-CIA team for final instructions. "Remember, this isn't just about making arrests. We're exposing a system that tried to turn law enforcement against federal agents, that exploited racial bias for intelligence gathering. We do this right, we help heal the divide they tried to create." As teams moved into position, she thought about how far they'd come from that traffic stop. The officer who'd pulled her over was now a key witness. Reynolds had rallied honest cops to stand against corruption. Congressman Chen had built political support for reform. Her mother called, sensing the importance of the moment. "You be careful out there today." "Always, Mom. We're doing this the right way." The operations room buzzed as the coordinated raids began. On multiple screens, she watched tactical teams move in on their targets. Years of intelligence training helped her stay focused as the operation unfolded. "First location secured," came the report. "Documents recovered. Second team in position. Suspects in custody at location 3. With each success, another piece of the corrupt network fell. They'd recovered training manuals that detailed the psychological manipulation techniques, found databases of tracked federal agents, seized financial records showing the money trail. The officer from the traffic stop provided crucial testimony, explaining how the program had exploited existing biases to create confrontations. Other officers came forward too, sharing their experiences, helping to dismantle the system that had used them. Reynolds coordinated with police departments across the country, identifying other officers who'd gone through the program, offering them a chance to come clean and help fix the damage. By evening, the main phase of the operation was complete. The security firm's leadership was in custody. Their files were secured. The network was exposed. In her office, she looked at the wall of evidence one last time. What had started as a personal investigation had grown into something much larger, an operation that exposed corruption, protected federal agents, and offered a chance for real reform in law enforcement. Her phone buzzed with a message from Congressman Chen. "Police Reform Bill passes committee. Your evidence made the difference." She smiled, thinking about all the people who'd helped make this happen. Reynolds with his unwavering integrity. The brave officers who came forward. Her CIA and FBI colleagues who'd worked tirelessly to build the case. But most importantly, she thought about what this meant for the future. They hadn't just shut down one corrupt operation, they'd exposed the tactics used to exploit racial bias for intelligence gathering. Created a framework for identifying and preventing similar schemes. Looking out her window at the city lights, she felt a sense of accomplishment. They turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for positive change. not through confrontation or public accusations, but through careful investigation, coalition building, and strategic action. Her mother's words came back to her. Sometimes the biggest battles are won by being smarter, not louder. They'd proven that today. And tomorrow, they'd start the work of rebuilding trust between communities that others had tried to divide. 1 year later, Agent Johnson stood at the podium in the police academy's main hall. The room was filled with a mix of faces, veteran officers, federal agents, community leaders, all gathered for the launch of a new joint training program. Change doesn't happen overnight, she began, looking out at the crowd. It happens one conversation, one decision, one action at a time. The past year had brought more changes than she could have imagined that night she was pulled over. The evidence they'd uncovered had led to a complete overhaul of police training protocols. The corrupt security firm's leadership faced federal charges. But more importantly, they'd created something new from the ashes of the old system. After her speech, a young police cadet approached her. "My brother's thinking of joining the FBI," she said. "Seeing you bridge these two worlds, it gives us hope." In her office later that day, she reviewed the latest progress reports. The new training program, developed with input from both law enforcement and federal agencies, was showing promising results. Incident rates were down. Cooperation between agencies had improved. Her phone buzzed. Reynolds, now promoted to captain, was calling with updates from his department. "The new protocols are working," he reported. "Officers feel more supported, better trained, and that community outreach program you suggested. It's making a real difference." She smiled, remembering how far they'd come. Reynolds had become a key ally in implementing the reforms, using his experience to help other departments make the transition. Congressman Chen's office called next. The police reform bill they'd helped pass was becoming a model for other states. More importantly, it included specific protections against the kind of manipulation they'd uncovered. "We're getting inquiries from police departments across the country," his aide reported. "They want to know how to implement these changes." Looking at her calendar, she saw her next appointment, a meeting with new CIA recruits. Part of her role now involved helping the agency diversify its ranks while strengthening ties with local law enforcement. Her mother had been right that day in the kitchen. This was about more than just one traffic stop. It was about transforming the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. The FBI training facility had requested her presence next week. They wanted her to help develop new protocols for joint operations with local police. Her unique perspective, as both a CIA agent and someone who'd experienced profiling firsthand, made her invaluable in these discussions. Walking through the academy halls, she passed photos from the first graduating class under the new program. The faces showed the changing demographics of law enforcement, more diverse, more representative of the communities they served. Her phone lit up with a message from one of the officers who'd come forward during the investigation. He was now helping train other departments in identifying and resisting the kind of manipulation they'd uncovered. "Your story made it possible for us to speak up," his message read. "Changed how we see our role in the community." Back in her apartment that evening, she added another news clipping to her wall. Not evidence this time, but progress. Reports of successful joint operations, improved community relations, departments adopting the new training protocols. Her mother came over for dinner, something they did more regularly now. "I'm proud of you," she said, looking at the wall of achievements. "You didn't just fight the system, you helped fix it." Later that night, she received an email about next month's federal law enforcement conference. They wanted her to keynote, sharing the lessons learned from the investigation and the changes that followed. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed one last time. A message from a young black female cadet she'd mentored. "Graduated today. Top of my class. Thank you for showing us it's possible." She smiled, thinking about the ripple effects of that one traffic stop. It had exposed corruption, yes, but more importantly, it had created opportunities for real change. Not through force or confrontation, but through understanding, cooperation, and persistent effort. The next morning, she had meetings scheduled with both police leadership and community organizations. Her role now was about building bridges, helping both sides see past their preconceptions to find common ground. Looking out at the city skyline from her office, she thought about all the lives touched by these changes. Officers who felt more prepared and supported. Federal agents who could do their jobs without fear of targeting. Communities that were beginning to trust their local law enforcement again. Her CIA work continued, but now it included this vital mission of transformation. She'd shown that one person, standing at the intersection of different worlds, could help create lasting change. As she reviewed plans for next month's joint training exercises, she realized they'd done more than just expose a conspiracy. They'd created a new model for cooperation between law enforcement and federal agencies, one built on mutual respect and understanding. The final piece of evidence from the original investigation still sat in her drawer, the dashcam footage from that night. She kept it as a reminder not of what went wrong, but of how far they'd come and how much further they could still go. Her mother's words still echoed. Sometimes the biggest battles are won by being smarter, not louder. They'd won this one by being both smart and persistent, by bringing people together instead of driving them apart. And that, she realized, was the real transformation, not just in policies and procedures, but in hearts and minds, one person at a time.